Alright, hi guys. So what we're going to do today is talk about the actual beginning of the Cold War. Remember we had said it technically starts with the Potsdam Conference, July 1945, but now I want to discuss how the period from about 1945 to 1949 where we could say the United States has the nuclear monopoly. We have all of the atomic weapons in the world until August 1949. And so what we're going to see is in this period, we're going to see the United States booming. We're going to see, a change in classic American policy. We're going to see, a reversal of a number of trends. But also, we're going to see the genesis of that competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. As I said yesterday, the Soviet Union, at the end of the war, has more tanks in Western Europe than the United States. They have more men than the United States, and indeed than Britain, France, the United States, all combined. Their tanks are now good. I mean, here we see, IS-2 Stalin tanks here and here. We have a T-34-85 here. We have an Su-152 howitzer here. And we have a tracked B-4 8-inch gun. I mean, these were huge, heavy cruiser size naval rifles the Soviets put on tracks. You can just track them in and direct fire if you need it. Why this is important is the Soviets, this is, common to what they have. They have more tanks than us. They have a lot of good tanks. The IS-2 has a 122 millimeter gun. The IS-1 or the Su-152 has 152 millimeter. You're not going to see anything in the American inventory that can rival that. We have our biggest tank is the M26 Pershing that has a high velocity 90 millimeter gun. But whereas the Soviets have thousands of IS-2s in the field, we send over at most 40. Okay, and that's by May 1945. So clearly, there's this thought, okay, we have two large armies in the same proximity. There's already those questions, can capitalism and communism coexist? That's a bad day. And then to that, we then bring in that whole technological aspect. And so with that technological aspect, we get what's called Operation Paperclip. And Operation Paperclip is the desire to capture, let me adjust my camera here. There we go. I never sit in exactly the same place twice, or I never have my monitor tilted the exact same way twice, so it's always, whatever. But with Operation Paperclip, and this was an American operation to try to get as many German scientists as possible. Remember, the Germans had led with the exception of the atomic bomb, the Nazis had developed the best weapons, the craziest super weapons, the V-1 buzz bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, the Me-262 jet fighter. They've got, rocket-propelled fighters, all of this stuff. And we wanted to capture these scientists and try to reverse engineer as much of that stuff as we could. We knew that any future war would be a technological war. And so what we see is we are willing to overlook war crimes. We're willing to say, okay, well, what you did was horrible, okay? But we need you. And the best example of that is Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun will be the head of NASA from something like 1957, 58, all the way until the early 1970s. Without him and his designs, we do not go to the moon. But Werner von Braun was an SS Obersturmbannführer. His rocket site at Peenemünde used Jewish slave labor. He knew about the Holocaust. The use of slave labor, he technically took part in the Holocaust. But he is never going to be prosecuted because we need his expertise to build ballistic missiles. Eventually, we're going to need it to build giant rockets to go to space. So, and I've got this thing, our Germans, their Germans, because the Soviets do something similar. They try to seize up as many German scientists as possible. And we see an arms race develop, both nuclear but also, especially with things like rocketry. And early on, it's pretty much Americans using reverse engineered German technology and Soviets also using reverse engineered German technology. Things like this, Bumper 8. This is a US V2 launch. We literally build our own V2 and test fire it, and all of this under the direction of Werner von Braun and many of his scientists. So what all of this means, if we take all of this together, we're already looking in late or early 1945 to the post-war world. We're looking at a world where we know we're going to be competing with the Soviets. We know this technology exists, and we're desperate to avoid any sort of technological gap. We want to make sure that we have the best stuff. And part of that we could also see that as being an overreaction to Pearl Harbor. I mean, before the war, the United States Army was smaller than that of Romania. Our, intelligence services were not that great. Militarily, our planes were often inferior to Japanese ones early on. We don't want that same sort of scenario again, because now, especially by late 45, it's imbued with atomic warfare. This realization that, there might not be time to rapidly re-equip an army or learn new doctrines, but it might be a case of whoever gets the first blow is going to win the war. So along with that, we see a rapid spurt of technology. 1946, we see Project Diana, where we take a huge radar set, basically, and bounce radar waves off the moon. For the first time in 1946, we can know exactly how far away the moon is. People had tried to work it out mathematically. I mean, I'm not going to lie. As you will come to know throughout this course, being a historian, my math ability is about the same as a fifth grader with a bottle of vodka. But there are people out there who actually know about mathematics and can sit there and say, okay, well, we think that, the moon is this big, this much mass, so it does this kind of orbital stuff, so it's going to be this far. I mean, what was it they said planetary-wise? They discover in the 1700s, I think it was 1781, they discovered the planet Uranus. And they noticed in its orbit, there, where it wasn't going where it should have been. And so somebody figured it out and said, okay, well, something's got to be tugging on it, so there's got to be another planet out there. They work out the math and say, okay, well, we think that planet would be here. And in 1846, within 1 degree of, where this person had predicted, they find the planet Uranus, okay? So people can work all this stuff out with math, but now for the first time, we can actually verify it. That we can say, yes, the moon is, however many hundreds of thousands of miles away from the Earth. That same year, in October, they take a V2 and do a suborbital flight. They put a camera in it. And in October 24, 1946, we get the first photograph from space. Okay, I think it's something like 85 miles up. It's, right there at the edge. But this had never been done before. Okay, we as a species had not been able to do this, and now we can. Okay, so now we've got better radar sets. We're looking to the heavens. We can take photos from space. Then there's a thing, what about air travel? You've got jets. How fast can they go? Well, they had thought that, if you listen to the term sound barrier, okay, what the sound barrier means is sound travels at a specific speed. Again, numbers, fifth grader, not going to, I don't know. Theoretically, you can go faster than the speed of sound. But they call it a sound barrier because traditional aircraft tended to lock up around that time and would crash, okay, if they tried to approach it. So the United States, we develop all sorts of new stuff, and we get the Bell X-1. And it's a new type of plane. It's got a different tail design to allow it to surpass Mach 1, the speed of sound. And a year after we take a photograph from space, on October the 14th, 1947, this man, Chuck Yeager, climbs into a Bell X-1 named Glamorous Glennis, breaks the sound barrier, travels faster than the speed of sound. So what we're saying is by 1947, okay, you have things changing. It is, the world of 1947 already does not look like 1945, which itself did not look like 1939. I'm kicking myself. I had more technological stuff in here, and I didn't put it in. Some of my favorites. I probably have the slide somewhere. But I mentioned, yesterday that, computers would fill up an entire room. Well, on one of them in the 40s, ESDAC, what had happened, the computer failed, and so they sent somebody to go in, and they found out, okay, a transistor burned out. Well, why did it burn out? A moth had climbed in, fried itself, got stuck, died, and it burned out the transistor. So the person removes the moth, writes on the form, I debugged the computer. That's where the term comes from. This is creating the modern world that we know. Okay. Now, what we're going to see is all of this stuff. Okay, V2s for spaceflight, Project Diana, taking photos from space, breaking the sound barrier. Most of this stuff is going to be used in a Cold War mentality. When Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, initially it was kept classified because we didn't want the Soviets to know we could do it. Already that alliance system is gone. When photos are taken from space, we don't always publish them right away because we don't want to let the Soviets know that we have this capability. So even though we're talking about this from a human advanced standpoint, in actuality, these are more military developments. So what's fueling all this stuff? What's fueling this distrust is the division of Germany. Remember, you have those huge armies right there. Germany is being divided, and this is what's called Bizonia, when the American and British zones are merged into one. But clearly, you have right there the Soviets directly pulling the strings for East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, the DDR, which, by the way, spoiler alert from Dr. Prince, if you're not sure about world geography, okay, if a nation has to tell you it's democratic, it's probably not. The People's Republic of China, okay, the German Democratic Republic, what is it, North Korea, the Democratic, I don't even know what they call it, but I know Democrat is in there somewhere. This is going to bug me. I'm going to find it out. Hang on. We're using my... Seriously, I don't know how I lived without a smartphone. I mean, let's see. DPR. I can spell. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We're just going to merge East Germany and Communist China into one. The DPRK. East Germany is not going to be democratic. And so what we see is we have in these zones both sides trying to remake Germany in their own image. We start pushing more capitalist values. The Soviets start pushing more communist values. And so there's the question again, can it all coexist? Eventually, after Bizonia, the French go ahead and throw in, so we get West Germany, then we get East Germany. But you still have the problem that Berlin is smack dab in the middle of East Germany. Austria will be divided as well. And so there's the issue then, West Germany and East Germany might have been able to coexist. Though obviously, we're not even talking at this point about letting Germany exist on its own. That's not even being remotely considered at this point. Germany is not going to be reunified until 1990, 1991. Right now, it's not a case of, okay, well, hey, World War II sucks. Germans, you're disarmed. Go back. No. West Germany is solidly under American domination. East Germany under Soviet domination. And it could have lasted like that. But there's always the question of Berlin. It's kind of right there, just a thumb in the eye, right? And so this is going to become a flashpoint. And so we'll talk about it more in a bit, but I want to go ahead and introduce what I like to call the myth of the good German. Now, what I mean is, if you look at the rise of Nazi Germany, okay, yes, it's true, not every person was a Nazi. In fact, Nazi party membership was limited to maybe, I wouldn't even say a quarter of the population. But how many people still voted for Hitler? How many people went along with him being chancellor? How many people went along with the Night of the Long Knives, the stuff against the Jews? The fact is, there are no major civilian uprisings against Adolf Hitler at all. A few assassins, there are some, attempt would-be assassins. There is the German resistance, which is, not that big. There's the von Stauffenberg plot, but that's mostly the old German officer corps. There's not, the people do not rise up against them. Because the people liked what Hitler had to say. The people tapped in to that, let's be blunt, anti-Semitism has been extant in Europe for thousands of years. When the Crusaders went to the Middle East to go kill Muslims, they slaughtered Jews along the way. So I'm not saying every German is a Nazi, but most Germans did know what was going on and were perfectly fine with it. Well, it sucks for the Jews, but it's not happening to me. That kind of mentality. So we have to create this this Cold War idea that, well, not every German was a Nazi. And why do we do that? We do that because look where East Berlin is. If we're pledged to protect West Germany, and thus West Berlin, if the Soviets invade, we have to go to war. Any war with the Soviet Union would probably be a nuclear war. So how do you convince people, let's say, 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis, okay, where the thought was we go into Cuba, the Soviets go into East Berlin, or West Berlin, we then respond with tactical nukes, they respond with strategic, and the world's at war. How do you convince people who fought the Nazis 17 years earlier to risk nuclear Armageddon for Germany? You do that by saying not every German was a Nazi. This is the kind of, but it's this, well, what would create this fear? That is just part of the time. We can see that with the Long Telegram, written by this guy, George F. Kennan. The name should sound familiar. The Cold War book I'm having you read by John Gaddis. Gaddis was a student of Kennan. They were friends. The book's actually dedicated to Kennan. Kennan was the ambassador to the Soviet Union. And in February 1946, he issued what's called a long telegram. Because, a telegram is supposed to be like that. Titanic sunk, stop, need help, stop. No, this thing was huge. Literally, the guy's like me. He wouldn't shut up. And what he basically says is the Soviets want to expand. The Soviets want to influence. And he creates this idea that the Soviets might want to try to fight the West. At the very least, they're going to try to intimidate the United States. They have their own agenda, and they want to put it out there. At this time, people believed what was called the domino theory. And the domino theory basically states that if a country goes communist, its neighbors go communist. Then the neighbors of those go communist, and on and on and on until the whole world's communist. So it was our responsibility as a free world nation to do was to stop that communism. Now, Kennan doesn't want war. He realizes that war is going to be absolutely brutal. We're still war weary. But he advocates the policy of containment. Don't destroy communism, but keep it from spreading. We're going to do everything in our power to ensure that West Germany doesn't go communist, to ensure that South Korea doesn't go communist, to ensure that South Vietnam doesn't go communist. See where I'm getting at? This is basically American policy until 1991. We're not going to directly fight communism. We're not going to try to destroy communism, but every time the Soviets want to expand, we will meet it. And so what we see is the Cold War never goes hot. But we are going to get a number of smaller wars that in their own right will be fairly deadly because we keep challenging the Soviet Union. Possibly a better way to espouse this doctrine comes from Winston Churchill, who at a speech at Westminster College in Missouri, okay, March the 5th, 1946. He argues that an Iron Curtain was descending across Europe. And with this Iron Curtain, pretty much he's saying this is what exists between the Soviets and the West. He says that, look, the Soviets are militarized. They're going to, enforce their will on these other nations. They're not going to ask Poland if they want to be communist. They're just going to put a bunch of tanks in Warsaw and say, if you don't want to be communist, I and my 30,000 tanks have something to say about that. They're going to impose their will. So what we see is the United States. We remain neutralized, or we remain militarized. We don't get rid of our army as we had done previously. We don't get rid of our navy. In fact, we keep troop levels fairly high. We'll come back to that in a second. We create a new independent air force. Why? Got to have somebody to drop the nuclear bombs. And we see that while we had wanted to denazify Germany, okay, this idea, okay, well, if you work for the Nazi government, you're not getting a job in West Germany. It quickly became a case of, well, we need to create a defense force. We need to do this. Okay, were you involved in the Holocaust? No. How influential were you in Hitler's rise to power? No. Okay, you get to keep your old job. And so it's because of that. In the West, we do the whole few people are Nazis argument. In the East, however, in East Germany, political commissars come in immediately and start trying to turn East Germany into a communist state. Not just one that looked communist, but one that was from the ground up. And so again, what we see is Germany becomes this pivotal battleground of the Cold War. The two sides are not going to fight there, but this is where communism and capitalism are pretty much, we're squaring off, and there's literally 500 feet between us. Now, that might not have mattered so much, but there's the issue of the nuclear monopoly. Again, as I mentioned, until 1949, we have the entire supply. I'll use nuclear interchangeably with atomic. I know I shouldn't. Generally, when I say atomic, I mean nuclear fission, so the first bombs. When I say nuclear later on, I typically going to mean things like the hydrogen bomb, which are nuclear fusion. We're not there yet. But let's call it, atomic test nuclear. I'm not going to care how you put it on the exam. I know what you mean. Big bombs that go boom. I know what you're going to mean. Now, 1948, okay, only 5 nuclear tests. And here's the question. I'll post a video that I love to show, and it always freaks people out. How many nuclear bombs do you think, nuclear weapons has mankind exploded? A few hundred, you would think? I gave a talk at a museum a few weeks ago, and I did the same thing. I played a video, and it was mostly old people, and you're like, oh yeah, a few hundred. 2053, possibly 2055 if North Korea's detonations were actually nuclear weapons. 2053. 1945, scientists are saying, hey, we might incinerate the atmosphere. Now we're literally lighting these things off like firecrackers, okay? Don't say human beings are smart. We build these huge weapons, and then we got to test them, which, okay, makes sense. And then what we're going to see is these tests become, it's part of the whole geopolitical scale. The Soviets do something we don't like, we'd let off an atomic bomb to say, hey, look what we can do. Remember, we have these things. It's all sort of positioning. Now, initially tests are going to be confined to the Pacific. But eventually the United States, we are going to irradiate the American Southwest. If you were me, I would not go through parts of Arizona or New Mexico without a rad suit, okay? Or at least, a Vault-Tec jumpsuit. Not doing it, okay? Because we just let off so many bombs there that, let's be blunt. John Wayne in the 60s or 70s filmed a movie called The Conquerors, which is a horrible movie because John Wayne as Genghis Khan is just a bad idea. I love John Wayne. No, that's a horrible idea. This was on an old nuclear test range. Well, he dies of cancer. And it turns out that about 3/4 of everyone who worked on that movie developed symptoms. I just went brain dead about the word here. Along the lines of what you would expect with radiation sickness, radiation poisoning. We literally nuked John Wayne. How un-American is that? That's why you shouldn't like nuclear bombs, folks. But we start blowing these things up like crazy. We do one, Operation Crossroads. 2 shots, Abel and Baker. And then what we do is, okay, if we blow these things up, either above or below ships, what are the effect on ships? Can we use this in naval warfare? So we tow a bunch of, old World War II, World War I ships out, boom, just to see what happens. Now, we forcibly remove the natives, who then come back and many of them die from radiation poisoning. Oops. Do we compensate them? No. Now, one of the good things that come out of this, okay, is in 1946, a new type of women's swimsuit was being invented. Something that was much more risque, something much more revealing, something that it took me 3 years to get my wife to wear, but that's another story. And the designer was trying to think of a name. Well, what the hell do I call this thing? Well, the Operation Crossroads shot was all over the news, and the guy thought the name of the atolls that they were testing this, the Bikini Islands. And so that's where the term for the bikini comes from, was because at the time we were testing atomic bombs near these islands. Now, why do we do it? Part of it's to test. What are yields? What are capabilities? How can we increase the yields? What can we do to make it deadlier? Some of it just showing the Soviet Union, hey, boom, look what we can do. But it comes at a price because, again, this really screws up the native inhabitants. We're not really forward thinking. And that's something to keep in mind, and that's probably one of the tragedies of the Cold War. We never think to what's going to come after. We only think, how can we project our power and influence and do something to check the influence of the communists. That's all we think about. So we do crazy stuff. We literally bring troops in to watch nuclear explosions. We bring camera crews in. I don't know about you. Without a fridge there to jump in, I don't want to be that close to a bomb. They would do stuff like, okay, have these guys watch. Yeah, my phone's not on silent, so whoop. Watch a nuclear bomb. Then after it dissipated, okay, go in and we want to test, can you provide assistance? Okay, in a time of atomic warfare, could you be able to go in and, effectively help out? Do they give them rad suits? No. Do they give them hazmat suits? No. They give them your plain Jane gas mask, and that's it. We literally irradiate, hundreds of our own troops because we don't fully understand what's going on. It's a bad sci-fi movie and I can never remember, but it actually, it doesn't parody, but it shows one of these tests, and then the guy gets so irradiated so much, he grows into a 50-foot monster, and he's like a human Godzilla, which I remember as a child I saw this, and apparently I've had a dirty mind my entire life. Here might be one of those comments and jokes that I had to apologize at the beginning. Does everything scale up? Because I couldn't help but notice even as a child that his underwear apparently also had to grow to that size. I guess, the limits of what you can show in 1950s TV. But what we're going to see, this is the kind of testing that we're doing. And this is just a small snapshot. Okay? We'll do other things like the Atomic Annie cannon, a 280 millimeter cannon, which if you're in Oklahoma, you can go see at Fort Sill and Lawton. We have it preserved. Let's build an artillery piece that you can load an atomic shell and shoot it out about 18 miles. On what planet is this a good idea? We build like 20 of them and deploy them operationally to Germany and Korea. This isn't something we built just to see if we could. We built and used this. We were prepping to use it in case of war. And so it's along with that, this fits into this change in American military policy. Historically, we shrink our military. Okay, historically, the United States has, we don't like large standing armies. Go back to Jefferson, Madison, framing the Constitution. A large standing army is a threat to liberty. Okay, this is what we had rebelled against. But 1949, we keep 1.45 million personnel in uniform, and we do not get below that number until 1996. Not until 1996. Now we want a large army. We want large reserves. We want them to be better equipped. We want the best technological stuff. We create an independent Air Force. Even in World War II, it's technically the United States Army Air Corps. No, we make an independent Air Force and pump a lot of money into that. And we create Strategic Air Command in 1946. Now these people, with the motto, peace is our profession, what are they there for? Nuclear delivery. We don't really capitalize on missiles until the late 50s, early 60s. We like bombers. We like that human element. We like a failsafe. So now we're going to create an Air Force so that we can have big bombers being able to drop a nuclear bomb anywhere we need it. Now, as we're doing this, okay, and I mean, coming back to this, it might seem like we love our nukes, and we do, but we will blow up more nuclear devices than anybody else. Videos I post. I also realize I need to post the videos from yesterday. I will do so, I promise. But if we look at the Barak plan, okay, this was a plan that we submitted in June 1946 to the United Nations. The United Nations had been created at the end of World War II. And we wanted to create something like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy, whatever it's called. I suck at acronyms. We want an international committee to oversee nuclear weapons. And why? Because we don't want to trigger World War III. If these small things can blow up Hiroshima, what can they do in 10 or 15 years? We want to avoid proliferation. We even were willing to go as far as, if the world agreed, not only would we ban nuclear weapons, but yet still funnel money into nuclear energy, we would even destroy our stockpile. We would voluntarily give up our nuclear weapons. 1946, we have the chance at a non-nuclear world. But the Soviet Union refuses. They say, no, we want a bomb. Remember what those scientists, Oppenheimer, guys like that, had said, that if you explode this device, the secret will be out. It can be built, and other people will want to do it. That's exactly what happens. The Soviets are 3 years away, but the Soviets want to be able to build this device. And so we see this, we see that, and it enrages our long-standing fear of communism. This is propaganda from the Red Scare back in 1918, 1919. U.S. closed on account of strikes. Or my favorite, if you ever want to strike, which, by the way, Walmart workers, McDonald's workers destroying the country, because if McDonald's workers strike and walk out, it leads to disorder and riots, which leads to Bolshevism and murders, which leads to chaos and who knows what. And that, my friends, is why we cannot pay a fair wage for a Big Mac. Okay? This is the kind of propaganda that's coming out of the United States. If you're going to have this in 1919, 1 year after Russia goes communist, and frankly, nobody cares about Russia, what happens when you take this same fear and apply it to a country that now is one of the two superpowers, has the largest army in the world, and at some point will get nuclear weapons? That's why we get so afraid. And we can see this fear. Okay, we see it in 19th century again. Gilded Age, the Homestead Strike, the Haymarket Square riots. We see it in the Red Scare. If you look at the Bonus Army of 1932, why Douglas MacArthur uses tanks and gas pretty much to drive out the marchers. It's because they're afraid it's a communist takeover. People were literally afraid that the bonus army of 1932 was another Bolshevik revolution waiting to happen. If we look at the Spanish Civil War, okay, American troops had volunteered and fought in Spain on the side of the Republicans. Because they're technically fighting for pro-communism, okay, they're going to be blacklisted and prevented from joining the American military in World War II. Eventually, they're going to be called premature anti-fascists, which I think there's a pill for that. But it's this whole, this is the kind of fear that exists in the United States. So now you take this fear of a communist enemy that's, and 19th century to 1935, 37, this fear of a communist enemy that can't project its power. And now again you have the Soviet Union. And we see the United States changing, we change what we do. We change who we are. Despite the fact that Truman would once say, I do not want a right-wing totalitarian response to a left-wing totalitarian threat, we see the United States fundamentally changing. Prior to World War II, remember, we had always focused on our own. The Atlantic, the Pacific, these were our natural boundaries. We only fought when we had to. We didn't care what Europe did. We didn't care what Asia did. Sure, we dabble a little bit maybe with the, open door policy. Sure, we'd care if our merchant ships got sunk during war. But now we get the Truman Doctrine. And Truman looks kind of pissy right here. Urgh. And we see with the Truman Doctrine, what this boils down to is the United States agrees we will supply military assistance and economic aid to anybody facing communist aggression, both from within and from without. Okay, we see it and it's focused on Greece and Turkey. Greece undergoes civil war after World War II, and one of the factions is communist. So we say, because you're facing a communist threat from within, we'll give you money. Turkey is facing Soviet aggression as part of this Russian long-standing desire to be able to do something with the Black Sea. We say, fine, we'll give you aid, we'll give you military equipment. So why do we do it? It's because Britain had long been the world's, well, let's be blunt. What is it? Team America World Police. Matt Damon. Britain had long been the world police, if you will. I guess it's British, so world constable. And, again, huge empire, so they're the ones responsible for, the balance of power. But Britain is more or less bankrupt after the Second World War. So they enter a period what's called austerity. They have to trim the budget for everything. And so Britain can't have this world presence. Britain can't maintain a large army. Britain can't maintain a large navy. Britain can't bankroll all of these various countries. So we step up. Truman steps up and on March the 12th, 1947, advocates that the United States will do this. We'll continue our role, what is it FDR had said, the arsenal of democracy. And we're going to do this. We pledge to defend nations against any communist aggression. And so what we see is the Truman Doctrine and containment. These are the shaping policies of American foreign policy doctrine all the way until 1991. We're going to contain communism where it is, and if it tries to expand, we will defend you, up to and including nuclear weapons, depending upon the case. This is one. North Korea invades South Korea, we'll send troops. North Vietnam, South Vietnam fight, we'll send troops. West Germany, we will have a large standing army in Europe. Okay, stuff goes on in Africa, we'll send aid. Stuff goes on in Central America, we'll send aid. We then assume as the superpower what we see as our duty to stop communism. And one of the ways we do that is economically. And what we're going to see, again, this transition from the United States only giving a care about its own area to everything. We now see it with the Marshall Plan. Europe, all colors to the mast. Cooperation, inter-European. Okay? Europe is blown apart at the end of the Second World War. Okay? Economically, they are trashed. Well, this is bad for the United States for two reasons. One, okay, power vacuums. Okay? Economic depression breeds extremism. That's how you get an Adolf Hitler. Two, okay, our economy is doing great. We're shifting from building, wartime goods, Sherman tanks, to cars, trucks, planes, refrigerators, all this stuff. And we go back to a historic problem we've had since the 1890s. We produce more than we can consume. Well, if European economies are in the toilet, they can't buy our stuff, we don't have any goods to sell to, our economy stumbles. So what we start to do is give aid to all of Europe. Woo the West, create for solid power vacuum, and rebuild their economies so that they can trade with us. Now we offer this blanketly to all of Europe. We say any nation who wants this, we will do. Even the Soviets. Now the Soviets say no. The Soviet satellites say no. But the West has no problem doing this. And so between 48 and 51, $12 billion. That's $111 trillion in aid. This is a stupid amount of money. But it works. Europe gets rebuilt from this to, an economic powerhouse. Let's be blunt. The euro today is worth more than the American dollar. Okay? And a lot of that is because we financially invested in Europe. But that comes at a price. Remember, historically, we don't care what's going on in Europe. Okay? When it comes to our shores, we will. But now, you don't make a $111 trillion investment and then say, buy Europe, do whatever you want. We are now tied to the affairs of Europe. 1948, we finally go against what George Washington had said way back in 1797. No entangling alliances. The United States should take care of its own affairs. Now, we're building up an alliance system. We have pledged to defend people against communism. And economically, we are supporting most of Europe. What all of this means is now we're seeing the United States go from that, agricultural experiment. Now we are a superpower. Now we are probably the most powerful nation on the planet. And so what we see is, this shift in American policy. It's probably the natural conclusion of what had begun since the 1890s. Expansionist, then isolationist. Now it's like we're running the whole show. We see aid, support, and why do we do this? In part, remember that whole two-ocean defense. Technology means it doesn't matter. If you can fly a plane from Europe to Washington, D.C., drop an atomic bomb and fly away, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't matter anymore. So fight them in Europe, not here. We also, it's this power shift because other nations can't support militaries. Their economies are in ruin, whereas we have been largely unscathed by the Second World War. So now you take this new dynamic, the United States wanting to try to control world affairs. And that's a large part. We do want to control world affairs. And I don't mean as a bad way, but we want to keep a balance of power. We don't want, the commies to get too much power and start a war. We want to keep things that what's the Family Guy joke? If I were riding on an elephant, it's the two symbols of the Republican Party, a big fat white guy who's afraid of change and an elephant. But it's this whole, here we are that big fat white guy afraid of change. We don't want change. We want to keep things as it is. So you have this new dynamic where we can, exert this kind of influence. Then you have, missiles, rockets, bombs, long-range aircraft. That's how you get the Cold War. That is the recipe for the Cold War. And, and it's not just the United States. We could even say The Soviet Union, it's something similar. They want to control world affairs because they don't want to get invaded again. And I will say this, who starts the Cold War? Well, the United States spent however long trying to say the Soviets did, the Soviets did. Fact is, it's both of them. It's because you have two people who won't just sit down and talk about their issues. We never want to destroy communism. They never want to destroy capitalism. But we let our fears get the best of us. Because we had one world war in the 1910s. We had one that was even worse in the 1940s. People weren't new. If this happened again, it was going to be even worse. And so with that, we try to create a mutual defense system. Since we're, again, that age-old no foreign alliance thing just out the window. And in April 1949, we create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. We do this because in Czechoslovakia, there had been a coup supported by the Soviets. And so there's this little bit of, it's fear. We're going to see war scares throughout the era. So we see as the European nations begin forming what will eventually become the European Union, okay, we see then the United States decides to take that to a military alliance. Take that European Union, or as they were calling it, the Western Union. No, you can't get a telegram there. And we will pledge our support as well. Why? Because we have this sizable military investment. So now you take that. We let West Germany and we let West Germany militarize. Why? Because if that's the flashpoint, they can help defend their own damn self. So the Soviets in 1955 create the Warsaw Pact and create their own defense alliance system. Okay? And the idea between these two alliances is that you can have two large multinational armies. If any of you are shooting fans, okay, what does the M16 use? 5.56 NATO. The idea being that almost any NATO assault rifle, whether it be made in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, can use that, same round. And those rounds are going to be loaded in what's called the STANAG, the Standard Magazine. So you can take a magazine from an M16, put it in a British L85A1, it's still going to work. Okay? That's the theory. The Warsaw Pact, they're all going to use AK-47 and later AK-74 derivatives. They're going to use the same ammunition, the same magazine. Again, we're creating supranational armies. But what this also means, once we get into the 50s and 60s, you now have two large supranational militaries that are both nuclear armed and clear divisions between the two. And that can be a problem. Okay? Alright, sorry about that for the little jump. Hopefully, just had somebody make a delivery, so hopefully this doesn't desync the audio. We'll see. So, this is a problem. Now, as this is going on, politics continue as usual. Okay? Truman, remember, had been the vice president. He's up for re-election. And Truman's one of those presidents. When he was in office, he was sometimes both. He ran the gamut. He was either popular or unpopular. But yet, looking back on him now, we tend to think how good of a president he actually was. As we see in 1946, the Republicans take control of Congress. Okay, that's something that usually happens after war shifts to the other party. 48. What we're going to see is a split in the Democrats. Okay, we see some Democrats, like Truman, others don't. We see some, who's going to be tougher on communism? We're also going to see civil rights becoming an issue. Okay, we're going to see, and I'll talk about this more when I do the civil rights lecture in a couple of weeks. But the rise of a party called the Dixiecrats. Truman wants to put civil rights on the Democratic Party platform. But, unfortunately, there were many Southern Democrats that did not want that. And so they create this Dixiecrat, and it's a Southern party who's pretty much their whole thing, to hell with communism, to hell with all that. We just want to ensure that, segregation is, we don't touch segregation. So many people predicted a win for the Republicans, but Truman at the last was able to pull it out. Now, May 1948, we're also going to see we're going to recognize the state of Israel. We'll talk about that later on. But why I mention all this is Truman maintains that old New Deal coalition. Okay? That old coalition of Democrats who were more progressive, who wanted reforms, maybe not civil rights, but reforms, better working conditions, higher pay, stuff like that, and more foreign policy minded Republicans, people who were like, okay, we need to be tough on communism. But he only barely wins. And this is important because I think Truman was the perfect, maybe not the perfect, but I think Truman was probably the best possible person we could have had at this time. Because while this is going on, we see the first overt challenge or, threat from the Soviet Union. And this is obviously, again, Germany. If we look at, in the British zone of occupied Germany, this is the standard daily ration that a German citizen would get. You would get, 6 pieces of bread, a tablespoon of sugar, a plate of Nährmittel, which pretty much just kind of a processed food stuff, and a tablespoon of marmalade. This isn't breakfast. This is it. This is all you got to eat for a day. So what we're going to see is once we have West Germany, the United States and the Western Allies want to more or less try to rebuild its economy. So without informing the Soviets, okay, we issue a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. And the idea is, okay, we're going to, new currency, new economy, we'll try to rebuild your society. And this enrages the Soviets. So the Soviets respond by closing off Berlin. Remember, Berlin is right in the middle of East Germany. There is only a single rail line, a single highway that goes from the western zone to Berlin. The Soviets block that off. Now they do this, they're not threatening war, but they hope, okay, you'll just give us Berlin. Now why Berlin? This currency is also debuted in West Berlin. At the time, there is no Berlin Wall. So what you have is in the western part, a huge economic prosperity. The eastern part, it's crap. It also means that now, because the economy is booming in the west, people from the east can't go over and buy goods. They don't have enough money. But people in the west can come over and destroy the East German economy. So the Soviets want to try to coerce them into, just giving Berlin to the Soviets. The United States responds with the Berlin airlift. We airlift in, from 1948 to 1949, all the supplies that Berlin needs. We can do this. We have that ability to do this. And again, part of containment, we have to check communism. Whether or not we care about Berlin, we can't let the commies have this as a victory. Now, one of the fun stories, and here's a bad joke, is, there were groups of people called candy bombers. And what they would do is they would fly low enough and they would throw chocolate bars for the little kids. Okay? Remember, 1945, 44, the last time these people saw American bombers overhead, they were blowing up their cities. So to try to ease the fear, they're throwing, Hershey bars and stuff like that. Which then leads me to wonder, if a plane's high up, guy throws out a candy bar, no, parachute fails, whatever, and it smacks a kid in the face and kills him, is it still technically diabetes? Just saying, death by chocolate bar. We're going to see out of this propaganda. Movies like The Big Lift, Hollywood propaganda, trying to get Americans involved in this, trying to, again, portray it as, look, we're fighting for freedom, the Soviets are the bad guys. We're going to talk about a lot of, in the 50s, Cold War propaganda. But we're going to see, this is going to be a common thing. Bad movies, such as I Married a Communist, or cartoons like I'll Make Mine Freedom. Anything to try to get Americans to believe that, communism was the bad guy. And if we look, we're not the only ones who are doing propaganda, but ours is probably right now the most readily accessible. Now, if we look, eventually the Soviets back down. One, there's the issue of the nuclear monopoly. Two, there's the issue that, and I don't know what the United States are, but I assume I mean the United States. There's the nuclear monopoly. There's the fact nobody wants a war yet. And it's also, it's not good politics. Okay, if the United States can resupply Berlin, where are the Soviets supposed to go then? All they're doing is handing us a propaganda win, so they back down. But what is important about this blockade is it shows that Germany, and especially Berlin, this is going to be the flashpoint for the war. This is if the Third World War breaks out, and it's between the United States and the Soviet Union, this is where it's going to be. And so people are going to watch Berlin very carefully all the way through the 1980s. Here's some Soviet propaganda that I used in my Cold War class. Pretty much what they tried to say is that the American planes were actually dropping bugs, beetles and stuff, to destroy East German crops. I've never seen a bug in a Hershey's bar. I'd rather not, but, But as lighthearted as this is, what I want to end off with now, and I realize I'm running a little long, I do apologize for that, is RDS-1, also known as Joe 1. This is the first Soviet atomic bomb. It is largely a copy of the Fat Man nuclear device that the Soviets had stolen. It doesn't help that people in America were leaking secrets. You're going to have, I just blanked on his name, but one of the original Fermi 5 who developed it leaked secrets to the Soviets because they said, look, I don't want the United States to be the only people on the planet with a nuclear bomb. And, he's kind of right. So now what we're going to see, this creates fear and panic. Americans question their safety. And out of this we're going to get films such as Duck and Cover, which, I will post because, Duck and Cover was a training film that they would show in schools to young kids. What do you do when you hear the atomic bomb siren? Okay? It's also a method of control, trying to make you think, okay, hey, you can survive a nuclear bomb. But what we're going to see is this creates paranoia. Okay? This creates fear. What if this is done to us? In response, Truman wants a military buildup. And we see April 7, 1950, only a couple of years before, a couple of months before the Korean War breaks out, National Security Council document NSC 68. And what this basically says is this is the codification where we say we are afraid of Soviet world domination, we're afraid of the expansion of communism, and it is the policy of the United States government to challenge that wherever we need, and that we are going to need a military sufficient to do so. And so what we see by 1949, any hopes of the two superpowers working together are gone. Any hopes that, okay, hey, this we can get rid of nukes are gone. Now the Cold War is in full swing. You've got half the planet worried about the other half. And the question becomes, for many, and you'll kind of get this with the language of Duck and Cover, which is from 1950. Literally, it's put out right after the Soviets test the bomb. The question is not if there will be a nuclear war. The question is when. When will somebody push the button or drop the bomb? So on that less than happy note, take it easy. That'll do it for this one. I will see you in the next video. We might do a documentary next time. I'm not sure. I'm importing over my night class version of this where I like to do a couple of lectures and then a documentary. We'll see how it goes. But regardless, I will see you in the next video. If you got any questions, let me know. Take it easy. Have a good one. Bye-bye.